In today's story, we're diving into a situation where Karen, an entitled woman used to getting her way, crosses paths with a prison guard who's about to show her that there are limits to what people can get away with. What happens when she blocks his way, trying to manipulate the situation? The answer is shocking, and it'll leave you questioning how far people can go when they feel like they're above everyone else. Stick around for this wild ride. Karen stormed into the busy public facility with a chip on her shoulder. She was already having a bad day. Her coffee had spilled all over her new designer blouse. The line at the coffee shop had been longer than usual. And now, as she walked in, she could tell that everyone was moving too slowly for her liking. She had no patience for anything today, least of all waiting her turn. Karen's eyes scanned the room as her heels clicked loudly on the floor, the sound an intentional reminder to everyone of her presence. Her eyes narrowed when they landed on the prison guard standing near the entrance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an air of authority that immediately set him apart from the other people around. His uniform, dark and pristine, fit him perfectly, and the stern look on his face said it all. He was a man of discipline and control. His posture was upright, as if he were a living statue, and he had the kind of confidence that demanded respect. Without hesitation, Karen marched up to him, her hands on her hips and a scowl etched across her face. She didn't even care that she was interrupting his work. She felt she deserved better than this. She deserved to be treated with more respect, and she was going to make sure everyone knew it. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. "I'm in a bit of a rush here, and I don't have time to wait in line. You need to let me go ahead." The guard turned his head slightly to face her, his eyes cold but not unkind. He had seen this kind of behavior before. The entitled, demanding people who thought the world revolved around them. The ones who believed that rules didn't apply to them, as if their status somehow made them more important than anyone else. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he replied in a calm, measured tone. "Everyone waits their turn. I can't make exceptions." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Excuse me? Do you even know who I am?" Her voice raised slightly, drawing the attention of a few nearby people. She had expected him to recognize her, to acknowledge her importance. But when he didn't flinch, her irritation began to grow. "I'm not waiting like everyone else. I have more important things to do than waste time here," she continued, her voice dripping with entitlement. "You will let me go ahead of the line, or I will report you for mistreating a paying customer." The guard didn't move an inch. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every word she said. He could tell by the way she spoke that she wasn't used to hearing the word no. She was the type of person who always got what she wanted, no matter who she had to push around to get it. "I understand your frustration, but the rules are clear. Everyone waits," he said, his voice unwavering, though still polite. Karen's lips curled into a sneer. She wasn't used to being told no, let alone being challenged like this. It irritated her to no end. She wasn't some random person who could be ignored or brushed aside. She was Karen, and people needed to respect her. She glanced around, her eyes scanning for any signs of sympathy, but the people in the room just watched quietly. No one willing to stand up for her or even give her the attention she craved. In her mind, the situation was simple. He was supposed to let her go ahead, and that was the end of it. But this guard wasn't playing by her rules. And she didn't like it. She took a step closer to him, her face contorted with frustration. "You don't get it, do you?" she snapped. "I don't care about your rules. I'm not going anywhere until you let me through." The prison guard stood still, his broad frame towering over her. His eyes never left hers as he stood his ground. He wasn't intimidated by her presence, not in the slightest. He'd dealt with much worse situations before, but this one, in its arrogance, was beginning to grow more frustrating than challenging. "I'm sorry, but I really can't do that," he said again, his voice steady and firm. Karen's jaw clenched. She wasn't accustomed to being ignored, to being dismissed. Her pride was wounded, and she couldn't stand the idea that someone, especially a man in a uniform, would have the audacity to defy her. "I don't care what you can't do," she spat, taking another step closer to him, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "You will let me go first, or I'll make sure you lose your job." With that, she decided she would show him just how far she was willing to push. With a swift motion, she stepped directly in front of him, blocking his path entirely. She didn't just stand in his way, she planted herself there, forcing him to either acknowledge her demands or take action. She stood tall, arms crossed, and gave him a smug smile, daring him to do something about it. The prison guard's gaze never wavered. He wasn't reacting the way she expected him to, and that only made her more frustrated. She had forced his hand, or so she thought. In her mind, the next step would be for him to back down or give in to her will. But to her disbelief, the guard simply stood there, not making a move. Her eyes flicked toward the few people in the room, trying to gauge their reactions. They were all watching her, some with quiet amusement, others with curiosity. None of them came to her aid, and she could feel the pressure mounting. She had always been able to manipulate situations like this, but for the first time in a long while, things were different. She was on the edge, and she didn't know how far she could push before her reputation, her pride, and her dignity started to crumble. The tension in the air was palpable now. The guard's stern gaze never left Karen's face, his patience seemingly infinite as she stood in front of him, blocking his path. She too was feeling the pressure. For all her bluster, Karen was starting to realize she had underestimated this man. His calm, unflappable demeanor was infuriating. She expected him to flinch, to give in to her demands, but he didn't. Karen took a step back and planted herself directly in his way once more, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Move," she said, her voice shaking slightly with the anger building inside her. "I'm not going anywhere until you let me pass. Don't make me repeat myself." The prison guard's expression remained unchanged. His body didn't budge an inch. He was a wall of composure, and Karen could feel her own frustration mounting like a tidal wave about to crash over her. It wasn't just that he wasn't listening. He was actively choosing not to engage with her. He wasn't reacting to her insults, her threats, or her demands. Her words grew more forceful, more desperate as the seconds dragged on. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she snapped. "If you don't let me go first, I will ruin you. I will make sure you never work here again." The prison guard's response was still quiet, still firm. "I'm sorry, Ma'am, but it's not happening." Karen's eyes burned with fury as she clenched her fists. She was no longer in control of the situation. She could feel it. Her every instinct screamed at her to escalate the confrontation further. She wasn't going to back down, and she didn't think he would either. But something in the air was shifting, and for the first time since the encounter began, Karen realized that she wasn't the one calling the shots anymore. She was no longer the one in control. Karen's breath quickened as she stood there, glaring up at the prison guard with her fists clenched at her sides. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she knew it. She had pushed him, threatened him, and still, he stood there unwavering. His calmness was starting to grate on her nerves in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had always been able to bully her way through these types of confrontations, but this man wasn't intimidated. He wasn't backing down, and it drove her mad. The sound of her rapid breathing was the only noise between them. Everyone else around them had fallen silent, watching the drama unfold, their eyes darting from Karen to the guard, sensing the tension building. A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance, but no one made a move to intervene. The guard had already shown that he wasn't going to be swayed by her words, and they all knew it. They were waiting to see how far she would take this, how much further she would push before the reality of the situation hit her. Karen's heart pounded in her chest. She was no longer in control of the situation, but she refused to admit defeat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had never been denied anything she wanted, not like this. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, the whispers growing louder as people began to murmur among themselves. She didn't care about the other people. She only cared about proving herself right in this moment. "I told you. I'm not going anywhere until you let me through," Karen repeated, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and desperation. She was pushing past the boundaries of civility now. Her usual tactics of using charm, guilt, and threats had failed. She had no other choice but to escalate. She stepped closer to the guard, close enough that her chest nearly touched his. She was trying to intimidate him with her proximity, to get him to flinch, to back off. Her eyes burned with determination. "Move!" She spat through gritted teeth, her face twisted with disdain. The guard didn't move an inch. His expression remained the same, composed, neutral. His eyes, however, had a glint in them now, a sharpness that was unmistakable. It was as though he was waiting for her to go further, testing her limits as much as she was testing his. Karen had underestimated him, and she knew it now. But she couldn't back down, not in front of all these people, not after she had gone this far. She took another step forward, her body now nearly pressed against his. She was close enough that she could feel the heat of his body through his uniform, the strength in his posture undeniable. He didn't react, didn't even flinch. The space between them felt electric, charged with her frustration and his steady calm. In a move that surprised even herself, Karen pushed against his chest, her hands bracing on him as she tried to shove him aside. Her force was met with resistance, his body solid and unyielding, like a brick wall. She pushed harder, but he didn't budge. Her pulse raced, the adrenaline in her system pumping wildly. "What are you going to do?" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You can't just stand there forever. You're not getting away with this. You hear me?" Finally, the guard's expression shifted, just slightly. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes narrowed as if weighing his next move. But his hands remained at his sides, his posture still unflinching. And that's when Karen realized just how wrong she was. This wasn't some underpaid office worker who would cave in under pressure. This was a man who had been trained for situations like this, a man who had seen things far worse than her childish demands. Karen's breath hitched in her throat as the realization hit her. She had pushed too far. He didn't have to say a word. His eyes told her everything she needed to know. She had been playing a game she didn't understand, and now the rules had changed. He wasn't just standing there. He was assessing her, waiting for her to either calm down or escalate further, knowing full well that she was running out of options. With a move that was too fast for her to react to, the guard reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was firm but not painful, controlled, calculated. The suddenness of it took Karen by surprise, and she gasped, trying to yank her arm free. "Let go of me," she yelled, her voice high with panic now. But he didn't release her. His fingers tightened slightly, just enough to make sure she couldn't escape. Karen struggled in his grip, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to get out of this situation, but it was clear that she was no longer in control. He had taken charge, and she had no power to change it. The bystanders watched in silence, some of them shifting uncomfortably at the scene unfolding before them. The tension in the room was palpable. Some people were even holding their breath, waiting to see how this would play out. Karen, in that moment, realized that the eyes of everyone in the room were on her, and that's when the full weight of her actions hit her. She was trapped. The guard was calm, unmoved by her struggles. He didn't speak, but his silence was deafening, a quiet authority that filled the space between them. Karen's initial anger began to turn into something else, a mix of shock and fear. Her pride had been wounded. For the first time in her life, someone had taken control of a situation she thought she could dominate. And it terrified her. She tried to jerk her arm free again, but the guard's grip was unyielding. Her eyes flicked to his face, and for the first time she saw something there, a quiet warning. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even frustrated. He was simply doing his job. And in that moment, Karen realized that she had gone too far. She wasn't dealing with someone who was just going to back down and let her have her way. This wasn't a clerk at a store or a customer service representative who could be manipulated with a few choice words. Her mouth went dry as she realized the true power dynamic at play. She had underestimated him, and now there was nothing she could do to fix it. The humiliation began to creep in, a sinking feeling in her stomach as she realized how foolish she had been. She had pushed, she had threatened, and now she was the one who was powerless. "Please," Karen muttered, her voice quieter now, the anger draining from her tone. "Let go of me. I'm sorry. I won't do it again." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but she didn't have any other choice. She was no longer in control of the situation, and it was the hardest pill for her to swallow. The guard's grip remained steady, and for a moment, he said nothing. But when he finally spoke, his voice was calm and level. "You've had your chance. Now, move aside." Karen stood frozen, her heart racing as she realized that her moment of reckoning had arrived. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, and for the first time Karen felt completely exposed, like the walls of her entitlement were crumbling around her. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. Karen's heart raced in her chest as the weight of the situation fully settled in. The guard's words echoed in her ears, cutting through the fog of her anger like a sharp knife. "Move aside." It wasn't just an order. It was a quiet but firm demand, one that carried the finality of someone who had seen it all before. She had crossed a line, and she could feel it now, every ounce of the tension in the air, thick with her realization that she had lost control. Her mind was scrambling, trying to find any escape from this humiliation, but she was stuck. The grip on her wrist tightened slightly, a subtle reminder that she had no room to maneuver. She felt as though the ground beneath her feet had disappeared, and she was teetering on the edge of a precipice she had never imagined herself facing. She wasn't used to being the one to apologize, to back down. She was the one who made the demands, who manipulated situations to suit her whims. But now, standing here with her wrist in the guard's unyielding hold, she realized how powerless she truly was. Karen's breath caught in her throat as the realization settled in deeper. She wasn't dealing with a soft, compliant person who would let her have her way simply because she screamed loud enough or threw a tantrum. The guard's composure was unnerving, and the way he stood, unwavering, made her feel small in a way she had never experienced before. She had thought she could intimidate him, but instead, He had turned the tables, holding steady in the face of her aggression. She had pushed him, tried to manipulate him with every trick in her arsenal, and he had not flinched. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how out of place her behavior had been. In all her years of getting her way, she had never had to deal with someone who wasn't afraid of her. Her pride, the thing that had always served as her shield, was shattered in an instant. It was now replaced with a humbling sense of dread. Karen's mind raced, her thoughts swirling with confusion and anger. She didn't want to give in, to admit that she was wrong, but at the same time, a small voice inside her knew she had no choice. This man wasn't playing by her rules, and she was losing. She tried again, her voice trembling as she looked up at the guard. "Please, just let go," she said, the words coming out softer this time, the defiance replaced by something new. Fear. Her fingers clenched around her wrist, as if by some miracle she could break free. But it was no use. The more she struggled, the more hopeless it felt. The guard's face remained a mask of calm, his eyes never leaving hers. His silence was deafening, a presence that loomed over her like a shadow she couldn't escape. It was as if he was silently daring her to continue, daring her to push harder, and at the same time, his eyes conveyed an unspoken warning. There was a quiet strength in him, a force of will that dwarfed her own. It was then that the full scope of her actions hit her. She wasn't just dealing with a man, she was dealing with someone who had been through far worse than this. Someone who had the resolve and the strength to stand tall in situations where others would crumble. The guard wasn't rattled by her threats, her insults, or her attempts to manipulate the situation. He was simply doing his job, and that made her feel even smaller. She tried to take a step back, her mind struggling to find a way out, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized she had nowhere to go. She had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. The guard's grip on her wrist remained firm, unrelenting, and it served as a constant reminder of how far she had fallen in this confrontation. The crowd around them had grown, but there was no one rushing to her side. No one was coming to her rescue. They all knew she had gone too far, and now they were watching her, waiting to see how she would react. The pressure was unbearable. Every single eye in the room was on her, silently judging, silently witnessing her fall from grace. Her heart thudded in her chest and her mouth went dry. She felt as though the walls were closing in, the air around her thick and suffocating. She had always been able to control the narrative, to twist things to her advantage, but not now. Now, she was completely exposed. Her anger, her sense of entitlement, her refusal to back down, it all felt like it was crumbling in front of her. "Let me go," she said again, this time with less conviction. The words were barely a whisper, and the guard's steady grip was a reminder that it wasn't up to her anymore. She could see his patience beginning to wear thin, though he hadn't said a word. It was a subtle shift in his demeanor that told her everything she needed to know. She was on the verge of being in over her head. For the first time in this entire encounter, Karen began to feel the weight of the situation fully. She had been pushing, but now she was the one being pushed into a corner where there was no escape. The guard wasn't interested in playing her games. He was simply doing what he had to do, and she had no power to stop it. She was no longer the one in charge of the situation. Her anger flared again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the same kind of righteous fury that had fueled her earlier. This was something darker, a fear that was starting to seep through the cracks of her bravado. She wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, but now she did. She wasn't used to being powerless, but now she couldn't deny it. Karen's mind raced, trying to think of a way to regain control. She thought of every tactic she had used in the past, every manipulation, every guilt trip she had thrown, but nothing seemed to work now. The guard's grip remained firm, and his expression never wavered. She had no leverage, no power. She was at his mercy, and that fact was sinking in deeper with each passing second. The bystanders, who had once seemed like distant onlookers, now felt closer. They were no longer just watching. They were witnessing her fall from grace, and Karen could feel every pair of eyes on her, watching as the facade she had so carefully crafted began to crumble. She had built her entire identity on being able to manipulate situations, to bend people to her will. But now, it was all unraveling. She could feel the sting of her own helplessness. Her chest tightened as she struggled for breath, her thoughts spinning in circles. She didn't know how to back down, how to admit defeat. But as she looked into the guard's eyes, she realized that there was no way forward without surrendering. She could feel the cold weight of reality settle in. The guard wasn't going to let her win, and deep down she knew it. The silence between them stretched, and Karen could feel her pride slipping away piece by piece. The power she had once wielded so effortlessly was no longer hers, and as the seconds ticked by, she finally realized that the only way out was to let go. Karen's hands trembled as she stared into the guard's unwavering eyes. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to keep fighting, to claw back some semblance of control, but for the first time in her life, she realized that there was no way out. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. The whispers around her grew louder. People were murmuring, shaking their heads, exchanging knowing glances. She could feel their judgment settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just an embarrassing encounter anymore. This was something worse. This was humiliation on a level she had never experienced. She had built her life around control, dominance, and the ability to bend people to her will. But now, she was the one being forced to yield. The shift in power was suffocating. The guard, still holding her wrist firmly but without unnecessary force, seemed entirely unfazed. He had dealt with far worse than an entitled woman trying to assert herself in a situation where she had no authority. His patience had limits, but he had not yet reached them. That in itself was unsettling to Karen. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't even particularly annoyed. He was simply enforcing the rules as he was trained to do. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry as she attempted to find the right words. But what could she even say? That she hadn't meant it. That she had simply been trying to prove a point. She had built her life on an unshakable sense of entitlement. But standing here, caught in a moment where she was utterly powerless, she felt something foreign creep into her chest. Shame. For the first time, she saw herself through the eyes of the people around her. She saw the absurdity of the situation, the sheer audacity of trying to block a prison guard as though she had any right to dictate his movements. She had been so used to throwing her weight around, using her voice like a weapon, that it never occurred to her that there would be a time when it simply wouldn't work. The guard exhaled slowly, his patience clearly running thinner. "Are you done?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with finality. Karen hesitated, torn between her pride and the crushing realization that she had already lost. There was no way out, no way to twist the situation in her favor, no way to turn the tables and reclaim control. Every second that passed only made it clearer. She was out of her depth. Her mouth opened, but the words refused to come out. She had spent so long perfecting the art of being right, even when she wasn't, that the idea of conceding was foreign to her. But as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, she realized that she had no choice. Finally, in a voice so small and defeated that she barely recognized it as her own, she muttered, "Fine." The guard didn't respond immediately. He simply held her gaze for a moment longer, making sure she truly understood the depth of her mistake. Then, without another word, he released her wrist. Karen took an unsteady step backward, rubbing the spot where he had held her. She wanted to say something, to hurl one last parting remark that would make her feel like she had regained even a sliver of dignity. But nothing came. The words died in her throat. The onlookers didn't say anything either, but their silence spoke volumes. They had all seen it. They had all witnessed her fall from the pedestal she had placed herself on, and that more than anything burned the most. She turned on her heel, not daring to make eye contact with anyone, and began to walk away. Each step felt heavier than the last. The heat of humiliation crawled up her neck, and her face burned with the realization that she had been bested in a way she never imagined possible. The guard, meanwhile, simply resumed his duties as though nothing had happened, because to him, nothing had. She was just another entitled person who had learned the hard way that the world did not bend to their whims. She would leave. She would stew in her own embarrassment, and she would remember this moment for a long time. As Karen reached her car, she slammed the door behind her and gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The confrontation replayed in her mind over and over, every detail seared into her memory. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to do something that would make the feeling go away, but there was nothing to do. The realization was crushing. She had lost. And worse, she had lost in a way that she couldn't erase. For the first time in her life, Karen had been put in her place, and no amount of shouting, demanding, or manipulating could change that.